Welcome to What's Going On, the weekly podcast and videocast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of What's Going On. I'm Pastor Katie here at First United Methodist, and I'm glad you could join me for this episode. I thought perhaps in this episode I would focus on two things in particular. One, a call for us to remember who we are. I think that fits in line with our series that we're doing right now on Renegade Gospel and talking about, focusing on who Jesus is and Jesus as Lord of our lives. And we're going to continue that conversation, but really looking at if Jesus is Lord of our lives, who are we? How do we identify ourselves firstly? And then what do we do with that? Now, if you're watching this podcast, I guess I have a little assumption, and that is that you might be United Methodist. This podcast was created by and for the people of First United Methodist Church, or if you're connected to us, but if you found us in some other way, or if you do not identify as United Methodist, as that vein of Christianity, I still hope that that what I offer today is valuable and useful, but especially for those of us who claim this as our home, who claim this as our tradition, I just want to offer a few words. And I am taking it from a couple of sources that I do have in my office. If you find this interesting and you would like to read a couple of very small books, I would be happy to lend them out. But the first is by Steve Harper, and it's called The 5 Marks of a Methodist, The Fruit of Living Faith. And I just want to share, when we say we are United Methodists, that people called United Methodists, the first thing that really means we're still Christian. We're Christian first. We're just like this certain, flavor of Christianity, if you will. In my mind, I just had there's potato chips, but then there's all these different flavors of potato chips. We're a certain flavor, but we're all potato chips. If that isn't helpful, I apologize. But United Methodist Christians are Christians who follow John Wesley and the teachings that he had about Jesus. John Wesley was someone who pointed to Christ and helped bring others into a relationship with Jesus Christ. We don't worship John Wesley, but we find his teachings and his methods particularly useful. And so we like to refer to him a lot. He is not the only source that we refer to, but we do find some of what he says to be very formative and compelling. Again, it's not that I am unaware of other resources within Christian tradition and history, and it's not that I am unwilling to use those. Again, United Methodist Christians just find that the tradition that has come out of this strain of Christianity particularly compelling and useful in their lives. So the 5 marks of a Methodist, again, by no means exclusive to Methodists and to United Methodists. Again, I just want to make that very clear. First, as a Methodist loves God, Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I think this should be the mark of any Christian, right? Is to love the Lord with all that you are. And that is your greatest priority, and that is your number one identity as a child of God. And I think Methodists are no different. If you identify as a Christian, if you say that you belong, that should be a mark that people see in you, that your love of God, and what does that look like and how you're living that out. So I would say that's number one. Number two, a Methodist rejoices in God. It's not just about loving God, it's about rejoicing in God. And what this makes me think of is there was an era of American history where there was a lot of these really powerful preachers, and it was called the Great Awakening. And there's actually 2 of them. There were 2 kind of rounds of this, the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And there were these people that were coming in droves to listen to these preachers. But the God of these preachers, the God that they would describe, was this incredibly judgmental, angry God that they needed to almost be saved from. And the most famous of these sermons that we still have today is by a preacher named Jonathan Edwards, and in his sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that salvation with Jesus is really uh, saving you from that. Um, I would say that that is not indicative of United Methodism and the strain that we have, that United Methodists love the Lord and rejoice in God and rejoice in a God who is just and is righteous and is holy and is perfect, but is also merciful, a God of grace, a God of love. And so United Methodists kind of retain the honor and the glory of God, but instead of having this image of God that's angry and ready to pounce on us lowly and poor humans, it's a God who is doing everything possible to connect with us. And so I think that's what I hear when I hear a Methodist rejoices in God. The third one is a Methodist gives thanks. This is something that I've a few different times I've preached on the topic of gratitude, and it's always been a really powerful, or it's really hit home in the church. People have really responded to it, because gratitude is a powerful practice. And I really believe that it is a practice. Gratitude is something we can choose to do, and then it is something that we begin to feel. But gratitude, giving thanks for everything. Um, and there's a lot of scientific research around how a practice of gratitude can be beneficial to your health, to like your physical health, but also your spiritual health and your mental health. The way that if you can choose to view the world through lenses of gratitude, how that shifts your interaction with the world. So a Methodist is someone who practices this gratitude, and it really is stemmed in a gratitude to this loving God who has again done the work to make a way for us to be redeemed, to be made whole, to be healed, to be freed. And so they all sort of tie together. But again, if you have an image of a really angry God, um, it's hard to have gratitude there. Or if you look out in the world and all you see is everything that's wrong with it, it's hard to be grateful for the things that you do have. And so I think that's a really important piece. The next one is Methodist praise constantly. Again, I would argue with, as I would with most of these, that this should be all Christians, not just Methodists. That we are told by Paul to be praying constantly. And just this last month, our Pastor Book Club book was on prayer. It was the Three Essential Prayers by Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott is not a Methodist. So I would say that there are other Christians out there who are definitely practicing this. Um, but this idea of being in constant communication, I think prayer of not even so much about what we are saying to God, but that communication, that nudging, that being aware of God's activity, that's all prayer. Prayer is that all manner of communication with God. One of the things that we talked about in that book club discussion was how constant prayer looks different than what maybe we imagine. If we are imagining that you're constantly, reading prayers, you're constantly reciting the Lord's Prayer, that, it kind of, what else can you even do in a day? But if constant prayer is that constant awareness that God is with you and that you can rely on God and that you can look to God for guidance and help and assurance, and that is constant prayer, and that a Methodist, and another way that I would talk about it is that recognition of God moments. I think that is a kind of prayer. It is again an interaction with, I believe that God has been at work and I'm beginning to see it. It's, prayer isn't just always what we're saying, it's what we're witness to, what we're recognizing, what we're handing over. And so I would agree with that sentiment. And the next one is a Methodist loves others. Uh, Jesus, as I already said the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Um, Methodist churches really stand on those two commandments of Jesus. Jesus says that on everything else, these two, like, hangs on these two things, that do these two things, and the rest should fall into place. And so I believe that as United Methodists, that's something that definitely guides us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to treat people with dignity and kindness and respect. And so, um, if we again call and claim Christianity as our own and claim the United Methodist Church as our home, these are parts of who we are that cannot and should not be separated from us ever. Now, the other book I want to lift up is one that I think many of you are probably familiar with at least a little bit. If not, that's okay. Um, it was written by a bishop of the United Methodist Church, who actually has South Dakota connections, and it's Reuben P. Joe. And the book is called Three Simple Rules, A Wesleyan Way of Living. I want to talk a little bit about the three simple rules. Um, this is what we would call like a rule of life, a way to guide our life. Um, I'm going to live by these principles. I'm going to make my decisions based on these principles. And these three simple rules we see kind of floating up in the work of Wesley, and it's coming out of what we see in the Bible, what we see the prophets of the Old Testament, what we see Jesus talking and teaching about, what we see Paul writing about, what we see in the letters. That there are these three overarching themes about like what are we supposed to be doing. What's the life that God has called us to, and distill it down. Now, I've already said that, the two greatest commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I would argue that the three simple rules are commentary on the two greatest commandments. And you're like, why is that even better? Two commandments, three rules. Well, I mean, if you hold these two together, I feel like you're gonna be pretty set as far as having um, guides for your life that are in line with what I believe that God is calling all of us to, a life that God is calling all of us to. So the three simple rules are do no harm, do good, and originally attend upon the ordinances of God, but as Reuben P. Job puts it, stay in love with God, which again, do good, do no harm. Those are good guidelines for how do we love our neighbors as ourselves and stay in love with God. Love the Lord your God. You can see how they're connected. And so I would encourage you that, and these three simple rules show up in the United Methodist Church and the way that we try to process and guide our own actions. You will hear them referenced a lot. I just did uh, work for the Board of Ordained Ministry, and the three simple rules will show up a lot in our interviews and in paperwork because they are something that are easy to remember, and a framework to help us latch on to, how do I move through this world? A world that feels so complicated, that feels everything feels hard to navigate at times. What am I called to do as a Christian? Well, first, do no harm. Now, that is incredibly difficult, but can we make a value that the choices that we make for ourselves, if we know that it's intentionally harming others, how can we lessen that? How is there other options for us? And so that can look a lot of different ways, but trying very hard to care about those around us. And some have argued even, doing no harm to the world around us. And, we have the green team that is starting to do that work of lifting that up in our church and in our conference. And you're going to be hearing more about that this year. I believe our annual conference kind of has that sort of theme to it this year. And so that'll be, I think, really fascinating and interesting. We also have been invited into some opportunities um, to explore what that looks like, doing no harm to our earth, to our home, to our planet. How do we live lessening the harm that we do? How do we be a church that is mindful of the choices that we make and how that affects not just the people around us, but the world around us. The second is to do good. It's not enough just to actively not try to harm things, but that when opportunity presents itself, that we are doing all the good that we can do. There is a quote from John Wesley that says, "Do all the good you can at all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, for as long as you ever can." And I might have missed one in there. But this idea that, God put us on this earth to bring the kingdom of God, to make earth as it is in heaven. And that requires us to do work. That requires us to be active in that and to stand against things that are opposed to the kingdom of heaven, and to make the places around us and the people and the spaces that we have influence on, to make them more reflect the values of the kingdom of heaven. Do good. Do no harm, do good. Those are really broad, but and again, sometimes maybe even impossible to do completely. But even for us to strive to do these things, I think are going to make an incredible impact. And the third one, to stay in love with God, to tend upon the ordinances of God. And what we're talking about there, the means of grace, sacraments, Holy Communion, study, prayer, fasting, all of these, gathering for worship, all of these things that connect us to each other, that connect us to each other and connect us to God. Because that is what's ultimately giving us that power, is our connection to God. It is ultimately what grounds us and motivates us and gives us the courage and the strength to do the good in the world that we have been called to do, to resist doing harm and evil in the world. That language is in our baptismal vows. And when we take on the vows of our baptism, it's one of the things that we promise is to resist evil and injustice. Well, that ability comes from our relationship with God. So we need to stay in love with God, and we need to stay connected to God to really have the ability to do those things. Again, these are two very small, very short books, but they are classics, and they're classics for a reason. And so I just offer those up to you today as a little food for thought, as a little, if you hadn't heard of them before, and an encouragement that sometimes life feels hard and overwhelming, but let us go back to the basics of our faith. Spend your days loving God and loving the people that God has placed around you. Treating them with love and dignity and respect. And I think if we start there, I think we'll be doing a whole lot of good. So until next time, God bless. Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Going On, a video and audio podcast of First United Methodist Church in Yankton, South Dakota. We'd love to have you join us for worship on Sundays at 10 a.m., either in person or via our live stream, which can be found at our website, www.firstumcyankton.org, or by searching First UMC Yankton on YouTube.